that red highlighted square. So it would select whatever item is underneath of it. Well, we can do the same thing with brain-computer interfaces. I already told you that we're really good at decoding limb motor imagery. The reason we're really good at doing that is because if you imagine movements of your left hand, your right hemisphere of your brain will change activation. And if you imagine moving your right hand, your left hemisphere of your brain will change activation. So we don't even have to be really good at our decoding. We just have to detect which side of the brain has changed, and that means we know which limb was being activated or is attempted to be activated or is imagined being activated. And so we can do this in 1 or 2 classes, so we can do left and right. Right now we're just doing one class, so a single button click for controlling this device. And we're doing this in individuals with ALS and locked-in syndrome. So we're currently working with a woman who has ALS. She's had ALS for a number of years now, so she's fairly stable in her condition, which is rare for ALS. ALS tends to be very rapid. But there is a population who persists for a very long time. The best well-known example of this is Stephen Hawking. He has had his motor neuron disease, which is a more general description of ALS, for over 40 years now, and is still able to communicate through his AAC device. And so what we're doing is in this case, we're going to do 2 things. We've only started with one of them for the moment, and that is detecting that preparatory signal. So if you imagine, this is just a zoom in of a potential device. This red square is going to move from fruit to banana, ice cream, cookie, candy, all over and over and over again throughout this entire grid. So there is a signal that we know about called the contingent negative variation. This is a negative voltage that you can record from EEG electrodes. So these are sensors placed on the scalp that record electrical activity of the brain. And this signal becomes more and more negative in its voltage as you are preparing to make an upcoming planned movement. Classically, though, it required that instruction to move to be incomplete. This is a very technical thing, and I can come back to it if people are interested. Suffice it to say that our paradigm, we weren't sure it would, but it ends up being enough to elicit the contingent negative variation. And what we can find is increased negativity immediately before the target icon was intended to be selected. And that's what's shown over here. So let me go back real quick. So on this, imagine banana was coming up, and it's somewhere in this second row here. So the individual using the device has to wait for all of these to go, so it is slow, but they know exactly when that highlight is going to happen. They can be building their preparation to make their right hand movement or attempted right hand movement or imagined right hand movement. And what we'll find is a negativity in the EEG activity right before that happens. We can detect when that negativity occurs and say, yes, whatever happens next is an intended movement, and select it. And that's what we show here. We did this with, so we are a lab at a college university, so we have a lot of college students as our control participants, and we have ALS participants as our target participants. And what we find is that both have this negativity shown in blue that occurs primarily over posterior portions of the head. I don't say brain here because we're recording on the scalp, so we don't know exactly where in the brain we are, but it's posterior. And we see this giant negativity in blue for target trials, and a smaller negativity in red for non-target trials. So the smaller negativity is a confounding problem. We have to be able to detect real negativities from false negativities. So that's a design challenge that we have. But in the woman with ALS, this is one of her data sets. I don't know if she's always this noisy or the signals are this noisy, or if it was just a recording day, so we have more analysis to do with that. But what you can see is that there is a decrease, an increase in the negativity immediately prior to the highlighting of the target item, which is indicated by this dotted line. And the non-targets have a far less negativity, almost none, compared to the noise in this signal. So we're actually able to decode her attempts at a far or about equal rates to the healthy control. So right now it's 64%. We've actually redone the analysis and have gotten up to 69-70% for decoding this intention to select the upcoming item. And so what we're going to be doing is using this in real time, bringing this participant back in, having her operate her own AAC device, she uses one, using our virtual switch. That's ongoing, so I can't report on that now, but if I am ever invited back, I'll tell you about it next year. And this is just how we actually made those improvements. For the individual with neuromotor impairments, like I said, we got to about 69, 70% for one of the individuals without neuromotor impairments. So this is a 20-year-old college student. We got towards 73% accuracy.
The percentages you're talking about are percentages of accuracy with respect to picking the next item. Is that what you're talking about?
That's right. So that doesn't tell the whole story, right? Your ability to not select when you're not supposed to select, so false positives and false negatives, is really the full confusion matrix is what we should be reporting.
Right.
And actually, the performance here ends up being driven by very conservative false positive rates. So we have very, very, very low false positive rates. We also have really low true positive rates. So we're choosing no more than yes, which is great in clinical medicine, right? You always want to choose no over yes in the event that the newest pharmaceutical drug is not really doing what it's supposed to do. In our case, our users, we want to be conservative because you can't risk alienating them. They'll just stop using the device. But they're also very willing and able and interested, and so they can tolerate a little bit of error if it means that it's going to improve their performance later on. Right. So any more questions about that type of interface?
Just one question. Is the next? I just maybe you're going here, but is the next step then to translate that selection into an auditory sound?
Sure. So these devices, the commercial devices, so our phones can do that now already. So these devices have that capability. We call them speech generating devices.
Right.
So when you make that selection, our device already says like banana or whatever. So it's already capable of doing that.
Is your goal to get from brain to auditory without that machine sitting in front?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. And before I get to that, I do want to say the next step to this research is actually combining the preparatory signal that I've been talking about with the active signal of the right hand movement, or the imagined right hand movement. So when we combine those two things, I think we'll get far above the 73% that I showed here. It's sort of like a confirmatory signal. Like if there was a selection, we can confirm it later on, and vice versa. Okay, so here is the next system that was just alluded to. We want to get from some mental state change directly to auditory output. And I'm being very coy about that because it's not, I'm thinking of the word banana and we're outputting the word banana. People are doing that, but think about how many words you know. Thousands. We can't possibly represent that in a computational model. It suffers from the curse of dimensionality, which means that there's an exponential amount of data necessary to even begin to represent that type of information. So instead, can we find low-dimensional alternatives? So instead of trying to predict thousands of words, can we do something more parsimonious? And there are a couple ways of doing that, and so we're down here now. And I'm actually gonna skip all this next stuff because this is the neuroscience part. I'll come back to it if people are interested, in favor of talking about how it's possible to do this. And so I've just said that we're not doing word prediction. But if you think about the way your vocal tract works, you move your jaw down, you allow your tongue to follow your jaw, and all of a sudden you're saying ah. You move your lips together, pressurize air behind them, and then open your lips up, and you've just said buh. So there are articulatory commands, movements of the jaw, lips, and tongue that are fundamental for creating different phonemes and syllables that can be combined into words and sentences. So instead of trying to decode thousands of words and hundreds of syllables, so ba, be, boo, can we decode movements of the vocal apparatus and use that as something that can generate speech output? Well, formerly, this wasn't really terribly possible. The computational overhead to synthesize something like that in real time was too much. So we tried a more computationally efficient approach, which is to use something called formant frequencies. Getting into a little bit more engineering here, the vocal tract can be described as an all-pole filter. What this means is that energy coming from the lungs going through the vocal folds generates harmonic noise. So this noise, has anyone ever played a reed instrument? So essentially your vocal folds are the mouthpiece with reed. In fact, if you were to listen to vocal folds without anything above it, it would sound like just a mouthpiece. And then your vocal tract above filters that sound. It provides resonance. So now we're getting into the realm of string instruments, where the shape of the violin provides all of its acoustic output. It provides all of its acoustic shape. This is exactly what the vocal tract is doing. You have something exciting a filter above that changes wideband excitation into what we know as acoustic speech. Well, it turns out in most languages, and certainly in American English, we have 8 vowel sounds that are known as monophthong, and they are steady states in a certain type of acoustic space defined by the formant frequencies, these resonances, where their frequencies themselves define the vowels. So right here, I'm kind of just showing this process. What we have is an articulatory configuration. The tongue is high on the back of the palate, the lips are closed and a little bit protruded. This is an ooh sound. If everyone, imagine yourself making an ooh, that's the configuration for it. But what happens is that we have a peak in the acoustic spectrum right here, another one right here, and another one right here. These define the first 3 formant frequencies that completely characterize an ooh sound. In fact, just 2 of them are enough to characterize an ooh sound. And that's what I'm showing over on this image right here. This is a 2-dimensional plot of formant frequency. Formant frequency increases the first one from left to right, and the second one from bottom to top. And the ooh is way down here. It has low F first formant and low second formant. E has a different articulatory configuration, a different set of resonances, and has a low first but high second formant frequency, and so on. And so what we can do is relate changes in motor status to changes in these 2 dimensions. So now instead of thousands, down to hundreds, down to tens of words to syllables to phonemes, now we can get down to 2 directions in the formant plane and ask people to try to manipulate the device for producing speech output. Here are a couple of examples. Do we have audio at all? I'll just make this really loud and put the microphone down toward it. Good luck. All right, so this is what our synthesizer sounds like. Yeah, you didn't get that at all. I don't know how this is going to go.
Pointed at the speaker.
Yeah, it's a Mac, they hide them.
That's right.
That's fine. Oh, where is your speaker?
Right up at the top. Right there.
Let's try this one. Oh, come on.
Right.
Did you hear it all?
Yeah.
All right, here is ah and ooh.
Oh.
Right, so we have e, ah, and ooh. So just by defining those 2 formant frequencies, we can define some of these 8 vowel sounds. If that's not enough, we can actually define diphthongs, so sounds like I and A, are just movements through the space. So I'm going to try this a little bit. It's not going to work as well because I never hooked into audio here, but have a listen.
Oh,
Yeah? So that moves from ah to e, so I. This is another word. It's not a diphthong. It's an actual word now.
oh.
You, right? And now this is the hard one.
Oh my God.
So I'm not going to go through that too much because it's going to take a while. But did anyone hear that with enough clarity to catch any of it?
How are you?
Very close. You can do how are you using this technique. This one is I owe you a yo-yo.
Oh.
Right? Surprised you didn't get that. It's I owe you a yo-yo, and it's because you can do I owe you a yo-yo. Right?
Wow.
So I did this with my hand, with a mouse. The goal is to be able to get someone using a formant frequency synthesizer using our brain-computer interface to not just get to isolated points in the space, but then to be able to move around in this space consistent with the statistics of American English.
Could you use the same sound technology for consonants?
Glad you asked that. We'll get to it.
Okay.
Yes-ish. Using this particular technique, you would, in order to do a B sound, you would exit the formant plane down here. You would exit and come rapidly back. To do a D sound, you would exit here and come rapidly back. And to do a G, you would exit up here and come rapidly back. The formant frequencies are an acoustic quantity, which means they are only defined in the presence of energy. Consonants, especially stop consonants, so b, d, g, p, t, k, are defined by the absence of energy, right? You need to block the vocal tract to some degree prior to releasing that acoustic output, releasing that pressure, in order for that perception of that sound. So consonants are precisely not defined by formants. But there are formant transitions from the release of those consonants that help define them acoustically, and we can use that information. So that's why the formant plane and the formant frequency synthesizer can work for consonants, but it's a lot of hard work, much harder than trying to do diphthongs. But there is another method, and I'll briefly talk about that. So here's the experimental paradigm. We ask people to produce an ah, e, or oo, but instead of having them think about ah, e, or oo, we ask them to think about making a left-hand movement, a right-hand movement, or a foot movement. The reason is that we know zero about how speech is represented in the brain through the recording of EEG. And the reason for that is that if I were to put an EEG cap on anybody in the room and ask you to speak, the electrical potentials of your face would completely corrupt the EEG signal.
Oh.
They occur at the same time, they occur in the same frequencies, and they occur at orders of magnitude greater amplitude. And it's very difficult to separate them.
Is that the same reason that you can't do like left blink and right blink as opposed to left arm? Because that's what I was thinking earlier. That seems like that would be an easier option. But
Exactly.
it's up here.
So,
Okay.
so we can detect eye blinks really well, but again, they're orders of magnitude greater. They're different though. We can actually more reliably separate them. And so we actually do a separation process in our protocols in order to remove the eye blink artifact so we can concentrate on the motor signal itself. But, and I'm going to take a pause here away from the science side of this. As someone who's interested in rehabilitative engineering, I want to use any signal possible that can operate a device. If that means using eye blinks in conjunction with something else, I want to do it. If they have some form of motor control, I want to use that plus the brain. So from an engineering point of view, yes, we should absolutely be using those things because it's going to be faster and better. But from a scientific point of view, I'm really interested in our ability to do motor learning in this very weird paradigm. Yes?
Can I jump from science to clinical?
Yeah, of course.
How would this, I know that this is in process, so it's
Sure.
not a concluded
Sure.
thing, but how would this application apply to, for example, a clinical subject like Helen's,
Kelly.
That's tough.
That's a tough one
No, I
because,
know it is, I mean, I understand the confounding stuff, but is that a direction of this research?
So I
Is
think-
that kind of clinical subject?
so I think blind and deaf is very difficult because deaf means you haven't heard language. So
Right.
you have no motor commands and motor control for spoken language.
Right,
And blind, we can't give you visual feedback, which is a key part of our paradigm. So this particular technique would not be applicable for Helen Keller, but the other techniques would.
so you could teach that sort of subject, the motor activity associated with words, it's kind of backwards.
Sure. So we could, yes, you could. So she was able to sign, right?
Yes, yes.
So we could use motor-based activity because she had skill with that, and use that for communication. But she wouldn't be able to perceive the communicative output, right?
Oh, man.
So key to brain-computer interface is this idea of biofeedback.
Right.
That you have to be able to observe the outcome in order to maintain and continue to learn how to operate the device.
Right.
Yes.
I'm sorry, because I came in late.
Sure.
I didn't figure out, I was going to be on time, but I can't figure out parking up here. I don't come up enough.
It's
When
hard.
I came, in fact, I was thinking, because I did a lot of biography of that brilliant scientist in all the ways they updated his stuff, so I guessed you were talking about that. But my mother had a major stroke in 1991, and she had the kind of, if I can even remember the terminology right, aphasia,
Uh-huh.
meaning that she lost her language and she lost the use of her right side, but she had tremendous reception. So
Sure.
I felt grateful the brief time I was able to have her here. I did get a speech pathologist from the university, and she even said my mother was a good candidate for just a computer at that time.
Sure.
You know, that she saw, and then sadly enough, she needed to go back home way up northern Wisconsin, you know, and nobody, you know, she didn't get to use it, but again, people with major strokes and that kind of aphasia, they would be candidates for this also then?
Eventually. So this technology is primarily focused on people who are completely paralyzed, but our goal is to actually go back and expand and try to adapt our techniques for the special circumstances of people with aphasia and apraxia and things like that.
Lots of varying conditions.
So many,
Well,
so many.
she was pretty majorly paralyzed, and she could use some of her left hand, that's why I could see, she could press buttons, but you know, she couldn't walk, and
Sure,
she
sure,
was
sure.
wheelchair bound, and you know, all of it was real pretty.
That's
But
right.
again, but the point you're making, and I thought that's what you were going for, because then you can work with someone like that.
Exactly.
I'm even forgetting that genius's name, what is his name again?
Stephen Hawking.
Yeah, because that's what you're going for, the people that really get paralyzed, that they're trapped in their bodies, and some cerebral palsy people are like that too then, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. So